So good afternoon, everyone. Always enjoyable to talk to people right after lunch. Hopefully I won't put everybody to sleep. Try and get some inflection in my voice, so don't do that. I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial. And I guess I actually have a slide on that. But we're going to talk a little bit today about automation. Not the automation, traditional automation controls, but how do we automate things like vulnerability management and other types of endpoint management within our OT environments? How do we do that safely? How do we do that with the cognition of recognizing that we can't always address and remediate risks in the most direct way, given our environments? And how do we apply automation in that kind of environment? So just by way of introduction, I'm the CEO of Verve. So Verve was founded, as I mentioned, I probably don't have to go through this much because if you were there this morning, about 30 years ago as a control systems engineering firm. We were designing control systems for power plants and water and steel and manufacturing, et cetera. And about 15 years ago, one of our clients, in that case, a power company, began to be regulated under NERC-CIP and needed security solutions to essentially secure the control systems that our organization designed. And so they said, okay, you guys designed them, figured out how to secure them. And so that was 15 years ago, and that was the first version of what we call the Verve Security Center. And now fast forward 15 years from there, and we've gone well beyond NERC-CIP and power to all sorts of sectors, and basically been helping our clients address these endpoint issues that they've had. We provide both a platform to do that, a software platform, as well as a range of services that support our clients in that sort of journey, in the risk management and security journey. So what I'm going to talk about today, three broad points. So first, having a vulnerability patch management strategy is becoming more and more important, given the large number of vulnerabilities as well as the risks growing. Number two, obviously there's a lot of challenges in doing this. A lot of challenges in efficiency, in labor, in risks to the system, et cetera, that we're going to talk about. And then third, and really where we're going to spend most of the time today, is how do we leverage automation to help address those challenges? How do we find ways to drive efficiency, focus, and frankly, higher security as a result of that automation? So with that, quick context. So if we look over the last couple of years, and we'll be issuing our report here next week on what 2022 looks like. But as you can see here, if you look at the number of ICS advisories, which used to come out from ICS-CERT and now comes out of CISA-ICS, you'll see a significant increase over the last couple of years. And by the way, 2022 looks equally high growth in terms of the number of vulnerabilities that are out there. Both advisories as well as the CVEs, which sit within those advisories. So you can have one advisory and multiple CVEs within that. And then the average CVSS score of that is up about 70% over the last couple of years. Right, so the criticality of these vulnerabilities is also going up. And to a lot of organizations, there's sort of this, oh my God, what am I going to do with all this? I got tons of information. Not sure how it went there. I got tons of information, tons of vulnerabilities. And in fact, now I'm being asked to do SBOMs, software bill of materials. And all of a sudden, I'm going to go from having these vulnerabilities, multiply that by 10. What am I going to do with all this? And that's being... So we get all these vulnerabilities, and then on top of that, regulators and particularly insurance companies are now asking us to do more. And so if you look at, for those of you who have been dealing with insurance requirements of late, there's typically a whole separate OT cyber policy addendum that you need to fill out to get insurance on, to have your cyber insurance cover your OT. And when you go into that, the pretty standard one is, do you have a defined processes for identifying vulnerabilities and patching of your OT environment? And you have to basically give an answer to that, and then they'll ask, and how? And so these vulnerabilities are not just getting awareness among boards of directors and OT personnel, but they're also getting awareness among insurers. And given the costs that insurers have been bearing here of late, a much greater focus on this. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the why. I'm sure if you're here, you probably are already dealing with this to some extent. But then there are the challenges. And we've just put a few of them up on the board here, right? Time consuming, right? I don't have time. My controls engineers, I'm already understaffed in my plants. How do you expect them to actually do all the patching too? I don't even know what patches are really required. Maybe I know from a vendor what they've given me, but is that all the software that's on the system? The vendors don't necessarily approve all of them. So what am I going to do in a world where they didn't approve the patch, but it's a critical vulnerability? The story of IT patching centrally and, pushing patches and rebooting systems while the paper machine is running, right? I don't know how many of you had that experience, but we hear that a lot. A variety of challenges, right? And a lot of it comes down to this balance of security on one hand, operational resilience or risk to operations of making changes you shouldn't, and cyber risk. And how do we balance all of those things when we don't have the bodies really to do this? And that's where we think automation needs to come to play. And so typically what we see is this 3-phase journey that organizations go through, right? So it starts with assessing and identifying what the risks are, what the vulnerabilities are. And by the way, risks in this parlance isn't just vulnerabilities, right? But it's all of the risks in your environment. And then there's usually a sort of, I'll call it a one-time catch-up, right? There's this big remediation, oh my gosh, we have thousands of vulnerabilities. Or risks, how do we get ahead of that? And then there's the maintain. Okay, so now we've done something to get more secure than we were. How do we on an ongoing basis maintain this? And as we think about automation, there's automation available at each and every step of this chain, and it's available safely without disrupting operations if you do it in the right way. So I'm going to walk through each of these 3 steps for a second. By the way, I think we're going to share out the presentation. So if you want to take pictures, feel free, but I think the presentations will be shared. So on the assess piece, on understanding, what are my risks? Number 1, applying technology to that process rather than just relying on essentially a manual labor-intensive collection. So oftentimes people go through a assessment and they'll send people out to the sites and they'll try and do walkdowns, et cetera. There's a technological way to do that without going through those manual processes where we can add automation. Using centralized technology to review those risks so we're not reliant on, 60 different people at each plant, let's say, or one person at each plant. You've got 60 plants around the world trying to assess their risks. Right? We bring all that data into one place that you can analyze and assess with a small team of specialists. And then being able to score and model risks. And we'll talk more about this. Number 2, on the remediate front. This is always the thing that makes people nervous. Oh, geez, I'm going to automate remediation. And we're going to talk about how you can do that without disrupting operations. But you can automate a variety of the tasks, from creating patch lists to creating approved lists from the vendors, to automating collection of internally approved patches in one place, and then actually the automation of deploying remediation, whether that be a patch, a configuration hardening, a user access management, et cetera, but doing it in a way that is 100% safe for OT, and we'll talk about how you can do that. And then finally, from a maintenance point of view, on an ongoing basis, being able to maintain that level of security. We all know that we've gone through this journey and we try and fix things, and then it rots, right? You're like, oh, geez, somebody changed the firewall rules, or, oh, there's new vulnerabilities, and what do we do about those? Or, a new account gets added to the system, et cetera. And so how do we maintain that and use automation to do that? Essentially doing real-time risk assessment, and then on a regular basis, updating and maintaining the security controls you have in place. And so I'm going to sort of walk through each of these 3 pieces as we talk today as to how to think about automation in each of these. So I'm going to start with the assessment piece. I'm going to talk about the tech-enabled assessment. So this is our view, a core element of the way you can start to bring scale, efficiency, et cetera, to your overall OT risk assessment. There's a bunch of benefits to this. Right? A lot of it ties back into labor savings, et cetera, but it also gets into risk. So first of all, you get a much better risk management. So often when we see people do the manual data collection, right, send out surveys, They may have people walk down the plants. You basically get to know whatever those OT engineers know and what you might be able to pick up off of firewalls that you may be able to pull configs off of or something like that. Maybe some packets that you can grab, et cetera. By gathering data directly at the endpoint, using technology to do that, you get a much deeper, richer view of the risks in that environment. And you can start to see what we call a 360-degree view of the risks that I'll talk about in a second. The second benefit of using a tech-enabled assessment is you get enterprise visibility. I don't have 5 teams going out, one to each site, and then trying to synthesize all those findings. No, I get all that data in one place, one centralized set of data where I can analyze them consistently, plant, or substation, whatever it is, so that I can get all that together and have a small group of people consistently analyze those risks. It accelerates the time to maturity because not only are we going to automate the assessment, but we're also going to put the tools in while we do that to be able to automate the remediation. And that'll come later in the discussion. Real-time updating, so instead of having to send a new team of people out every year to do another assessment, you literally have a constantly updated risk view with risk scores and attack paths, et cetera. And then finally being operationally safe, right? The way this is done is it's safe. We're not going in and trying to mess with control systems with technology that might risk it, like running a scan, a vulnerability scan on that system, right? So being able to do this without having the dreaded, IT scan that knocks off a bunch of PLCs and potentially key processes. So those are what we see from the assessment point of view in terms of the benefits of providing some of this automation. So how do we do that? So what's on the left-hand side is essentially a depiction of what I'll refer to as the Verve machine, the Verve Security Center machine. And what it's doing is it's bringing data together into a database that allows us to then essentially analyze risk in a holistic way. So it starts there in the middle with asset inventory, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the details of that today. The point here, though, is that asset inventory is an endpoint-based approach, meaning every single asset in the environment directly pulling data from that asset. So not trying to just depend on what might be on the wire, but actually communicating and getting data directly from the asset. Done with the experience based, as I discussed before, with 30 years of control system engineering experience to do that safely and effectively. But that asset inventory, which is done, very quickly and easily without a lot of infrastructure and hardware, allows us to then add in a series of views to the machine. So number one is vulnerabilities. Great, so because we know every piece of software, whether it's an application, whether it's a firmware version, an OS, whatever, we know that, and so we can quickly discover vulnerabilities. We know the patches that have been deployed or not. We know the configurations. So we'll come back to this a little bit, but being able to understand, okay, great, well, there's a vulnerability, but is there an offsetting, a compensating configuration that essentially makes that vulnerability less risky or less critical? Pulling back all of the users and the account data, because oftentimes what we find is an asset may be secure from the sense of very few vulnerabilities, it's patched, but it has a whole bunch of dormant users. It's got users that are, passwords that are very old, et cetera, et cetera. So gathering that risk view, gathering back the malware status of that device. Does it have anti-malware at all? Is it in, if it's whitelisting, is it locked down? Is the signature been updated, et cetera? We also bring back, essentially, we have an intrusion detection capability, which is really more for the maintenance phase. But by using this, we can also identify risky behavior that is ongoing in the system. And then finally, what is your incident response risk? Meaning, do you have available backups? Are those backups up to date? Were they successful, et cetera? So how are you from a risk point of view in being able to recover? So essentially bringing back all of that endpoint data allows us to assess what we call that 360-degree risk of the asset and the network, right? Of what are the potential risks to each and every one of those assets. And so as we think about that 360, right? So it's the inventory, it's the vulnerabilities, it's the patches, configs, et cetera, et cetera. Also on the top left there, the asset criticality, right? So we have, because of our control systems experience, we can apply models of what the asset criticality is based on the function of the device based on its connectivity, but also can import if an organization has asset criticality that they've determined of themselves. We can import that directly into the platform and allow an organization to start to prioritize using asset criticality as an additional metric. And so those 360-degree risk view allows us to start to make trade-offs. So let me just start with vulnerability analysis, right? So first question is, all right, how are you going to know vulnerabilities? The platform allows us to get in and gather literally every software, every firmware version, what patches, what KBs have been deployed, et cetera. And so we can then discover, based on knowing vulnerabilities, how many are critical, right? How many are high, et cetera, and then get into, do they have a known exploit, right? So we can pull data out of CISA and others where we know if there's actually a known exploit for those. And this becomes a bigger issue as we talk a little bit further. But there are a lot of vulnerabilities out there in OT today that have no known exploits. And how do we think about the balance of that versus, you've got WannaCry sitting on that device, as an example. So first thing is gathering the vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned, then gathering configuration data, right? So being able to analyze for these devices, what is the current settings on the configs, right? So as an example, there may be a vulnerability on a Cisco device, and that vulnerability is that it can be taken advantage of with, HTTPS or something. Well, the question is that enabled or not? Or do you have a configuration setting that's essentially disabled that? Well, that's pretty helpful to know if I'm going to be running around with my hair on fire, or alternatively is I've found at least some compensating control to that. So by pulling in these configs, we can take that and combine it with our vulns and decide, okay, how critical really is this one, right? Or have we solved is the wrong term, have we mitigated it in some way with a compensating control using configs? And by the way, we use typical standards like DSysTig and others, but many of our clients have built their own standards, and so we can bring those in if a client so chooses. And so one of the parts of the assessment is, okay, how good? Because almost none, from what we've seen, of our organizations have active AD centralized working in their power plants, for instance, right? Each vendor has a domain server for that unit oftentimes, right? So trying to manage this through GPOs oftentimes in many organizations is very difficult. And so essentially what Verve is doing is providing that almost like centralized AD sort of visibility within a very, very distributed environment. Whoops, I think I hit the wrong button. There we go. So then once we get all that data in, well, that's great. I got a ton of data. What the hell am I going to do with all this? And that's where the automation really starts to come in, right? Is I can say, okay, I have all of that data in one database. And then we can build models within Verve that actually tell you where are the greatest risks. And so we've essentially built automated risk scoring of these assets. And what that does is it takes an asset type, for instance, HMI, PLC, whatever. It then adds in the criticality of that device. And that can be, as I said, pre-calculated by you all, by a customer, or we can actually analyze that, and we have ways of doing that. And then we add in the risks. Okay, vulnerabilities, patches missing, config settings, et cetera. And we can start to create an initial sense of what is the risk of that asset. And then moving in from there to having that unmitigated score or uncompensated score, we can then add in controls. So what other controls? Is there a firewall upstream of that? Is there a configuration setting that reduces that risk? Is there application whitelisting, and is it in lockdown mode? A variety of different things that then can spit out a residual risk score. And so as we start to think about how we're going to attack the remediation phase, we can get into a very rich discussion around, okay, where are my biggest risks? Which assets, or frankly, which paths, and I'll show that in a minute, are those that are the riskiest? And we can do that through automation, right? You have to have the data. So first thing is you can't do this if you don't have the data. But once you have the data, the power is in the automation of the analytics to say, where are the greatest risks? Which are those that I need to do today, and which can I put off? Because there's no way we're going to be able to address 4,000 critical vulnerabilities overnight. We're going to have to find a way to work through them in a sequence, and that focused on risk. From that data, we can then start to model attack paths. One of the big questions always as we get into these assessments is, oh, well, can you do a pen test? For those of you who do pen tests in OT are tricky because if you do it the wrong way, you trip the plant, particularly issues. So oftentimes pen tests essentially stop at a certain layer, or alternatively are done in lab environments or whatever. What this allows us to do is essentially do what I'll refer to as a virtual pen test, right? So we have all that data and we can now start to model different attack paths and whether our mitigations would be in place to stop that attack path, or whether an attacker, if they came through here, would be able to tap this vulnerability and that vulnerability and work their way down into the system. And this is just one example, but the model allows you to start to essentially analyze what are the different threat vectors in this environment and how do I then prioritize where I want to start. Now, sometimes it might be really easy, right? Like I have no firewall. Okay, that might be a good place to start. But other times, you have certain controls in place, or at least you think they're in place, and how effective are those against different types of attacks? So then, as we move from that automated assessment part, prioritization, risk scoring, prioritization of the greatest unmitigated risks, we then get to, okay, what can we do to remediate this stuff? How are we going to be able to fix it? And so we have coined this term or in OT and security anyway, of think global, act local. So the concept here is I'm going to gather that data that we discussed centrally. I'm going to get all of that data up to a common platform so I can see it centrally. I can have a small group of people scaled in their understanding of OT security do the analysis part. But when it comes to actually taking actions, chances are that in most environments, I want to have OT practitioners, people who understand that process, be involved before I start fixing things. Because I can possibly fix things the wrong way, I can fix things at the wrong time, all sorts of things. And so having the technology, the automation designed in such a way that I can centralize the analysis, the planning, the playbooking, so to speak, distribute those actions locally, but have local control. By local, what we mean there is not necessarily physically local, but local in the sense of people who understand that process, that local process. So it's a paper mill. Okay, well, I'm not going to patch that and reboot it while the paper mill's running. So I need to understand that. Or alternatively, there's a particular configuration setting that I like, okay, I want to make sure that I've got the users of that mill involved before I start making those changes. But that automation then allows those people at the mills, I'm using mills as an example, you could have a mine, whatever you want to think about, having those people have automated essentially a toolkit to execute on the recommendation. So that, in other words, those actions can be distributed, but the timing, the testing, and the execution of that action is controlled by those who know that process the best. And so it essentially allows you, literally you can serve it up so that when they have an option to just execute the action, or they have options to not execute it and whatever, and then centrally, you know if they did it or not. So there's this ability to bridge this IT, OT, or centralized distributed environment with an architecture that allows for that. And so then there's the automated, so now we know what we want to fix. How do we automate that? So we've got the baseline inventory. We have identified the vulnerabilities and patches that are missing. And then you can review those vulnerabilities. You can review those patches and essentially approve them and create essentially subsets of patches that have been approved and those patches that haven't been approved. And typically our clients will have hundreds of sites, dozens of sites, whatever it is, and each one of those may have a different control system vendor or maybe multiple different control system vendors. And so they're dealing with these spreadsheets, PDF documents of approved patches. Right? What this allows us to do is get all of that in one database. So you got your Honeywell, you got your Siemens, you got your GE, you got your Emerson all in one place so that you can make decisions about with a smaller team rather than everybody. So review and prioritize, develop those plans centrally, and then testing and deploying, this is the act local part, and then being able to document and know that the success happened, right? So this is where the automation again comes in. I'm not relying on somebody sending me a spreadsheet saying what they did. I know within 15, 20 minutes whether or not that action has actually occurred or not, because I'm seeing the central visibility. And this is too much of an eye chart. I'll just, for this big of a room. The point here is we can start to prioritize 80/20s on these things, right? So by going into the databases, we can prioritize which patches cover how much of my risks, right? So we can start to do Paretos of how to prioritize even in the patching. Like I said, it's just, it's too much of an eye chart for this larger room. And I know this sounds like an eye chart too, but I think it's important. So one of the challenges that we see is that we put in this, we go through this wonderful process of assessing, we then remediate, and then stuff happens. What one of my colleagues says, rot sets in. Basically, we get people changing firewall roles. We get people adding accounts. People bringing in a USB and sticking it in and saying, oh, geez, I just added that software. It's no big deal. Can run through a series of things. And by the way, there's all sorts of processes that one can put in place to try and avoid this, right? Change management, alerting, et cetera. But without that, you end up with rot. And that would assume that people are actually making purposeful changes. Then there's the new vulnerabilities come out. And so if we do nothing, there will be more vulnerabilities tomorrow than there are today. And so by having automation, we can start to put in place a way of maintaining that security that we were able to achieve initially. So maintaining it, so you know what? Every time a new password is created or not, we can get alerts on that. We can monitor those things. Canary files, great way of doing this, right? So we can monitor, we can put canary files on devices and know if that device is accessed. And if that canary file is accessed, it means that that's probably ransomware because no one else would access that file, as an example. We can alert on unplanned changes to controllers or field devices. Backups is a big one, right? Oh yeah, I got backups, right? When was the last time that machine was actually backed up? Because the backup system is down locally at some facility and I don't have visibility. By bringing automation in and by bringing that central visibility, I now know, oh, okay, those devices haven't been backed up or these devices failed their backups, et cetera. And I could go around this, but the point here is the automation allows us to maintain a visibility into what's changing and what's rotting out there so that we can then go back and refresh, right? In other words, go back and make sure that our controls that we put in place are in place. Some people have asked, well, wait a minute, can't we just automate reversing, right? So, okay, great, I have a configuration management and I want to, and if it changes, I want to go back to the original. Okay, typically what we find is that there's a need or a desire to have a human in the loop of that because maybe there was a very purposeful reason for making that change. And if you go back automatically, you create operational issues. So by having the automation let you know and the ability to go in and automate that action to go back, let's say, you can do that, but this allows you to have essentially that local, think local, think global, act local again, to have that OT practitioner make sure that that's an appropriate response. And I could go around here a little bit more, but that's the general gist of the maintenance. And so one of the questions often comes up of, okay, so how much can you save in this, right? How much can automation help? And what we found is that automation can save roughly 30%, 35% on the assessment phase, meaning reduction in travel, reduction in frankly, reduplicated work, et cetera. And then on the essentially ongoing maintenance, et cetera, the ability to have that centralized view, number one, and have all of the data in one place to be able to make those risk trade-offs of, okay, I'm really going to focus on this, not that, et cetera, significantly reduces the amount of work, but also reduces the amount of labor it takes to do it because now I'm centralizing it. Now I'm basically consolidating that into a small team rather than having a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen different sites trying to manage this themselves. And obviously the remediation, the ability to build those playbooks and distribute that. And that can deliver roughly about a 70% savings based on what we've seen. So there is a way to use that automation to both essentially prioritize your efforts, reduce the costs of assessment, reduce the time it takes to remediate, and also automate the maintenance of this on an ongoing basis. So with that, I'm going to end my prepared remarks, and then I will ask any questions or comments that folks might have. Yes, sir. Yeah, so back to Windows XP, we can go back on the Windows side to NT if you really need to. Most of the time, the conclusion is it's Windows NT, right? It's really risky. We could learn a little bit more about how risky, but it's probably you just know it's a Windows NT. But you can put them on there. But obviously that only works for Windows, right? Or Windows, Unix, Linux, Mac, whatever. The question is, all right, well, what about all the embedded stuff? You're not going to put an agent on a PLC. You're not going to put an agent on a controller, et cetera. And so back to the 30 years, been around for 30 years, what we've essentially built is an interface, what we call our agentless device interface, which will communicate with thousands of different embedded devices in their native protocols. So not wait for them to communicate and try and figure out what's in the packet, literally go ask them for their data. And we've built this using our control system knowledge, right? So we've been programming control systems forever. So we know, okay, yeah, if you're going to program a Rockwell PLC, this is how you do it. And people do it every day, right? People communicate with PLCs all the time. You just have to do it in the right way, with the right message, with the right protocols, et cetera. And so that's what we've essentially replicated, is the ability to communicate with all these different embedded devices in their native protocols without any risk of tripping it and knocking into it, et cetera. And that also allows us to get through backplanes and all that kind of stuff to the detailed asset data. Yeah, yes, sorry, thank you. So, yep, we have a booth, number 20, I believe it is. Anyway, when you walk in, it's just to your left in the main room. We'd love to, we've got TV, we're happy to do demos and all that, absolutely. And we have two client speakers this week. So Tammy Klotz, who will be talking at 4 o'clock today, and Leah Wagner, who will be talking tomorrow about different parts of what we do, right? So we've talked a lot about the automation of some of the vulnerability assessment, et cetera. But the platform does a variety of other things. This has been sort of the focus of that. And so each will talk a little bit about different parts of what Verve does. Any other questions? Terrific. Well, thank you for your time, and please do come by and see us at the booth over the course of the next couple of days. Thanks very much for being here.